Hello, before we start today's episode, I wanted to let you know that I am doing a theatre show in Edinburgh on the 17th, 18th and 19th of December. The show is called Unquiet Objects and is 3 adaptations of classic M.R. James ghost stories in collaboration with Parrot Theatre Company. It is on at 7 p.m. in the Banshee Labyrinth on the 17th, 18th and 19th of December, and you can get your tickets at reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com.
Most people overpay for car insurance, not because they're careless, but because switching feels like too much hassle. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/ACAST today.
If you're a smoker or vapor ready to make a change, you really only need one good reason. But with Zyn nicotine pouches, you'll discover many good reasons. Zyn is America's #1 nicotine pouch brand. Plus, Zyn offers a robust rewards program. There are lots of options when it comes to nicotine satisfaction, but there's only one Zyn. Check out zyn.com/find to find Zyn at a store near you. Warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical.
Hello and welcome to episode number 300 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Lexi Hadley, Sam Ruddy Kulkarni and Tori Renee. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week. Our film review is Black Phone 2. The Black Phone 2 was released in 2025. It has 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb and 71% on Rotten Tomatoes. Bad dreams haunt 15-year-old Gwen as she receives calls from the Black Phone and sees disturbing visions of 3 boys being stalked at a winter camp. Accompanied by her brother Finn, they head to the camp to solve the mystery only to confront the Grabber, a killer who's grown even more powerful in death. So before I collated this review, I had to go back and listen to my previous Black Phone review when I watched it, the first film. And I was kind of I kind of enjoyed the first film. And I couldn't remember very much of it, which probably isn't a great sign. But I did have similar things about Black Phone 2 that I enjoyed. So for example, the exploration of the relationship between Finn and Gwen and their relationship with their dad. So in the previous film, their dad is violent and abusive towards Finn and Gwen, and their relationship is difficult, and there's a whole bullying storyline, and it's interesting to see how that has developed over the years that have passed. Again, we've got characters that are nuanced. They're not just good or bad. So their dad is desperately trying to atone for his previous violent behaviour. He seems to have got his shit together, stopped drinking, is now being a decent dad to the pair of them. And then Finn, who survived this awful ordeal in the first film, is now fully leaning into really aggressive, violent behaviour and, beating people up in school. And it was really interesting to see the development of these characters. We often see that in horror films where they fall into the trap of making characters either good or bad and not showing the grey area that exists for human beings. Whereas I think this film does this quite well. I also enjoyed that this film had kind of a feel of the early 2000s horror thriller genre where there is a supernatural mystery to be solved and everyone is scrabbling to try and solve the mystery before something bad happens. That was very prevalent in like the early 2000s with films like The Grudge and The Ring, for example. You know, you had the protagonists who were piecing together the jigsaw of this story and hoping that they're going to find a solution to everything that's happening. And I enjoyed that. I like a good horror mystery, you know, a horror thriller mystery. And I also really enjoyed the setting of this story. So we're in the mountains in a raging snowstorm in an old Christian camp. And I think those kind of summer camps are a very American thing. I'm sure they exist in other countries. I'm sure they exist in the UK in some places. But that idea of going off for a month in the summer to this camp where everyone's in like cabins and it's in the woods and you have to do like survival stuff, that to me feels very American. So I am always quite fascinated with that kind of environment for this kind of story, because it's the perfect environment. You've all these kids who are in this isolated place, and in the case of this particular film, you've got, you know, three teenagers who are in this place in the middle of a raging snowstorm trying to convince the adults around them that weird shit is going on. I did also enjoy this film visually. So there are a lot of dream sequences, and in the dream sequences, they all had this old like analog film type feeling to them. So you could immediately establish that what you were watching was taking place within a dream. But it was also fundamentally, you know, stylish and interesting to look at. And to be honest, that was kind of it for me in terms of the things that I liked about it. There were a lot of things I really disliked about this film. So my first thing that I wrote down was that I'm still really disappointed in Ethan Hawke in this film. He didn't scare me in the first one as a real man, and I said in the first review that I was disappointed in his performance. I think it was a gift of a part, and he just didn't scare me. And I really felt like in this one, as some sort of Freddy Krueger from Temu, I didn't get it either, and people are raving about his performance. I don't get it. I do not understand when people are like, oh my God, this is such an incredible, crazy, scary performance from Ethan Hawke. I just don't think that it is. I actually think it's quite limited. And I mean, look, right? I'm going to say this isn't a spoiler. I don't care. The minute he started ice skating, I was over it all. And that's no shade to ice skaters. If you're an ice skater, I'm sure that if you wanted to, you could be really intimidating and really frightening. Totally get that. But when he's gliding sort of beautifully and elegantly and gracefully across the ice, I just found it funny. I just thought to myself, throw a stick in front of that man, and he's going rumbling, tumbling on that ice. I for whatever reason, put a serial killer on ice skates. Or rather, the ghost of a serial killer on ice skates in a dream, and I'm not going to find that scary. And maybe that's just me. And that kind of brings me to the next bit that I just couldn't get past. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. I hate a dream sequence. I make no secret of that. I don't like dream sequences. I find it gets to a point where you're like, oh, this is stupid and boring. And I just felt like this whole film was just one long nod to Nightmare on Elm Street. And I just got really bored of it, to be honest, because we just spent so much time in dream sequences watching shit happen. And there's not good storytelling. And I know that obviously, so you've got Gwen is a great character and she has these prophetic dreams. I understand that. But we spent kind of, I would say, 3/4 of the film in her dreams. And to be honest, the grabber doesn't show up for ages. So we kind of ended up with this really convoluted story. And there was so much exposition in like the final third of the film that I just kind of got bored with the story. And there was this weird, I felt anyway, there was this weird kind of thread of Christianity the entire way through, where it was like prayer will help. And if you talk to Jesus, you'll be saved. And that's fine. Like there's no shade on that whatsoever. But it felt kind of weirdly out of place in this film. And I kind of had this same issue with Keeper last week. When you are trying to create a convoluted story, you do need to spread that out throughout the entirety of the film. You cannot have an exposition heavy end of the film because it takes away from the ending itself. And if you want to create mystery and ambiguity, you can do that while still telling a good story. And this film didn't quite manage that for me, I think. And you know what? The last Black Phone film, I had a complaint about bad child actors. And we're still here. We're still here with shite child actors. There were some really horrible amateur and just strange moments in a phone booth. So there, obviously a lot of it is based around phones and a phone booth in particular on this Christian camp. And there were all these strange moments where things were happening outside the phone booth that the character on the phone in the booth couldn't see, but they just felt really amateur and the acting felt really poor. Or rather, I don't know, the setup just didn't feel scary. And they just somehow managed to find the least convincing child actors again to play the ghosts of the little boys who are trying to communicate with Finn and Gwen. There's a moment where they're all banging on the glass of the phone box. And it honestly, there was such little acting or passion in that moment that I thought to myself, you know what, if I was actually seeing that in real life, I'd be like, oh, you're actually not very scary. It doesn't feel like your heart is in this haunting. So I'm probably not going to bother investigating this story any further. Anyway, look, it's grand. I feel like this is one of those films where I'm just not getting it, because the reviews have been quite decent. They seem to be quite positive, but it's just not for me. I'm going to give it 2.5 stars. So that's 2.5 stars for The Black Phone 2. And I don't know, if you can find a way to make an ice skating dream demon scary, then please let me know. I'm all ears.
AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
If you're a smoker or vapor, ready to make a change, you really only need one good reason. But with Zyn nicotine pouches, you'll discover many good reasons. Zyn is America's #1 nicotine pouch brand. Plus, Zyn offers a robust rewards program. There are lots of options when it comes to nicotine satisfaction. But there's only one Zyn. Check out Zyn.com/find to find Zyn at a store near you. Warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical.
Most people overpay for car insurance, not because they're careless, but because switching feels like too much hassle. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/ACAST today.
Hey, Ryan Reynolds here. Wishing you a very happy half-off holiday because right now Mint Mobile is offering you the gift of 50% off unlimited. To be clear, that's half price, not half the service. Like Mint is still premium unlimited wireless for a great price. So that means a half day. Yeah? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Which brings us to our story this week. And our story this week is not about ice skating ghosts. You'll be disappointed to hear. But like I said, if you can find one that's scary, I'm here for it. We are going to dive straight into our story. So let's get into it. Times were tough back then. I think that's a phrase we've all heard before. But I also think that sometimes it's difficult to imagine exactly just how tough things were not that long ago. Picture this. We're in the first quarter of the 19th century. Cars are slowly replacing horses and carriages on our streets. A string of photographs is being spliced together to form the first moving pictures. The light bulb and electricity are changing the very way we live inside our homes. And we could still be hung at the gallows for stealing a loaf of bread. Capital punishment, mutilations and hard labour camps are very much at the forefront of justice systems all across the world, and sparking many a debate on what justice truly means. Faintings, fightings, whistlings, Charles Dickens wrote after witnessing the double executions of a Mr. and Mrs. Manning for murder. Brutal jokes, tumultuous demonstrations of indecent delight when swooning women were dragged out of the crowd by police with their dresses disordered gave new zest to the general entertainment. Charles was one of over 30,000 onlookers gathered at Horsemonger's Lane for what was being called the execution of the century. It was the first time in over 150 years that a husband and wife were being hung together, and the population of Britain had showed up in force to witness the macabre spectacle. I believe, Charles later wrote, that a sight so inconceivably awful as the wickedness and levity of the immense crowd collected at that execution this morning could be imagined by no man, and could be presented in no heathen land under the sun. The horrors of the gibbet and of the crime which brought the wretched murderers to it faded in my mind before the atrocious bearing looks and language of the assembled spectators. It was becoming increasingly clear that harsh punishments that had initially meant to deter crime were now being perceived as crimes in and of themselves within the minds of influential people across Europe. And while those influential people worked to change legislature and overhaul the justice system in places like Britain, over in America there were others who were putting their desires for reform into real-life action. It appeared to the pacifist Quaker community of Philadelphia that the biggest problem with the justice system was that it perpetuated violence. Yes, a hangman could rid the world of two murderers by executing them at the gallows, but by doing so he became a killer himself. The damage done by a thief would be doubled if not tripled by the violence caused by his brutal flogging, and so on and so forth. It was a never-ending cycle. No, if the judicial system was truly supposed to bring justice to the world, it would have to fit within the confines of the Word of God. So the Quakers got to brainstorming and came up with a unique solution to the problem that the whole of mankind was facing. And during that brainstorm, the Quakers found themselves doing the very thing that they believed would forever turn criminals away from sin. Thinking. Well, sort of. There was no question that criminals would get their comeuppance in the afterlife, but when deciding what punishments those criminals should face in the here and now, the Quakers came up with a little thing called self-reflection. The theory was a simple one. By imposing a period of strict self-reflection upon the accused, a criminal would have no other choice than to face the sin within themselves and be compelled to change their ways. There would be no floggings, no hangings, or police brutality. A criminal would be locked away in solitary confinement and given ample time to think about what they had done wrong. Yes, the Quakers had essentially decided that the entire criminal population of Philadelphia needed to be in solitary confinement. And in order to facilitate that, they were going to need something far bigger than what standard prisons could hold. In 1821, ground on the new and improved Eastern State Penitentiary in Fairmount was broken, and by the time the project was complete and the penitentiary had housed its first criminals, the facility had forever changed the concepts of corporal punishment. It took 8 whole years to build this top-of-the-range penitentiary. Spreading out in the shape of a star, the building was divided into long corridors that joined around a central guard tower, meaning that fewer guards would be needed to keep a watchful eye on hundreds of prisoners. The prisoners themselves were kept in state-of-the-art cells. Gone were crammed prison cells, straw mats and buckets in the corner for the imprisoned to relieve themselves. Each prisoner was given their own cell with central heating, running water, and their very own flushing toilet. That was more than the President of the United States had over in the White House at the time. But that was about where the amenities of the then most expensive building in America ended. This was where punishment began. Prisoners were locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. They were allowed no contact with the outside world, which included no letters or visits from their families or loved ones, or even the guards that were watching them. Prison guards wrapped pieces of cloth around their shoes so prisoners wouldn't hear them patrolling and try to communicate with them. And whenever a prisoner needed to be transported from one part of the facility to the other, the guards would place a black hood over their heads so they wouldn't even be able to see the other prisoners. Meals were delivered through hatches in cell doors with no human contact. The only source of entertainment available to prisoners was a copy of the Bible that they could only read during the day, as the only source of light inside the cells came from skylights in the roof, which were aptly called the Eye of God. The prisoners were subjected to prolonged periods of total isolation. But humans are not designed to be on their own, especially not for months or even years at a time. In a desperate attempt to make contact with each other, the prisoners were known to communicate through taps on the pipes or whispering through the walls. And of course, they were often caught while doing so. Inmates speaking with each other went against the fundamental values of the prison itself, and offenders were punished vigorously. But what else could the prison do to the prisoners when violence was out of the question, and the prisoners had already been cut off from everything else? There were some rather brutal answers to that dilemma. One of the first courses of action was called the iron gag. If a prisoner was found talking with one of the others, his cell would be rushed by guards carrying a series of shackles and chains. The prisoner would then find his hands shackled behind his back, and chained to those shackles was a cast iron gag. The gag would then be sealed around the prisoner's tongue, and the prisoner would then be left alone to contemplate his new series of offences. In some cases, the prisoner would be released after another long period of punishment, but in the case of Matthias Macumsey in 1833, things would go from bad to worse. Matthias, a prisoner serving time for manslaughter, was caught talking to his neighbour and then shackled into the iron gag. He was then left bound in chains in his cell for about an hour, but when the guards returned to release him, it was already too late. Matthias was found in a pool of his own blood. While fighting the shackles, he had torn off his own tongue and had bled to death. The administration at the penitentiary were not blind to the increasing mental health issues this form of strict isolation created, and in an attempt to counter those unintended side effects, the penitentiary only ended up making things worse. Believing that mental illness was spread by the blood circulating in a prisoner's body, doctors in the facility came up with their own unique way to combat that. It was called the mad chair. Prisoners showing signs of mental illnesses were strapped into this chair. The tighter, the better. The belief was that if a prisoner's blood flow was restricted, the mental illness would have a harder time flowing through the prisoner's body and they would be cured. Prisoners often went days bound to this chair with no food or water and their limbs slowly being starved of blood. It was common that a prisoner would then have to go through amputations or surgery after parts of their bodies had literally swollen, blackened, or essentially died while still attached to them. Prisoners who were caught breaking penitentiary rules in the winter could find themselves dunked in ice water and then left to hang on prison walls overnight. They were often found frozen to death in the morning with their skin covered in ice. And for those repeat offenders, there existed an even stricter form of solitary confinement. Buried underneath a part of the prison known as Cell Block 14, the Klondike was a series of tiny cells made of reinforced concrete. They were perfectly square, had no windows, no lights, and no plumbing. For those subjected to the Klondike, they were thrust out of the frying pan and into the fire. What little comforts they had in their cells above ground were stripped from them as they were locked in these cold, dark cells for weeks, sometimes months at a time. Eastern State Penitentiary was a place that could drive even the hardest criminals mad. Infamous Chicago gangster Al Capone spent 8 long months locked up in the Eastern State Penitentiary and would leave the facility forever changed. His connections had made sure that his cell within the prison was as luxurious as a cell could be. He had fine furniture, a desk, and even oil paintings on his walls. A far cry from the others around him who only had a Bible for comfort. And yet, even Al Capone was plagued by the Eastern State Penitentiary and the terrors that haunted its walls. Al Capone was known to let out blood-curdling screams in the middle of the night. He would shout and cry and beg for someone called Jimmy to leave him alone. And who's Jimmy, I hear you asking? The mysterious spectre is believed to be Jimmy Clark, the brother-in-law of the legendary gangster George Bugs Moran, otherwise known as Al Capone's greatest enemy. On Valentine's Day 1929, several of George's men, including Jimmy, were holed up in their bootlegging headquarters in Chicago when they saw teams of policemen heading towards them. The men, believing they were about to be arrested, prepared to confront the police, only to find out that the policemen were actually Al Capone's men in disguise. Al Capone's men opened fire, killing 7 of George Moran's men, including Jimmy Clark, in the process. Al Capone was never convicted for any of these murders, but many believe that Jimmy Clark got his own form of justice in the end. So the story goes that Jimmy paid nightly visits to Al Capone and tormented the man who had ordered his execution. Al Capone's fear was so real that the guards at the Eastern State Penitentiary would often come bursting into his cell, believing that Capone was genuinely under attack, only to find the mobster cowering under the covers and otherwise completely alone. Even after leaving the facility, Al Capone was still plagued by Jimmy and called in a medium in an attempt to get rid of the spirit once and for all. Nothing worked. In fact, things only got worse. Locked behind bars for tax evasion, this time in the notorious prison of Alcatraz, Al Capone contracted syphilis, which then spread to his brain. Day and night, he screamed at a man named Jimmy that no one else could see, and he screamed until his dying breath. In many ways, Al Capone and his experience in the Eastern State Penitentiary laid the foundations for the prison's formidable reputation. He is perhaps the most widely known victim of a haunting behind the facility's bars, but he wasn't the only one. Far from it. Entire cell blocks in the prison are said to be haunted, one of which being cell block 12. Many witnesses have reported hearing voices and a strange cackling laughter echoing down the empty corridors, often followed by elusive shadowy figures. Other witnesses tell tales of hearing disembodied whispers and being overcome by an overwhelming feeling of dread. On-screen paranormal investigators have even captured a video that appears to show the figure of a man walking down the cell block. Across in cell block 4, others have claimed to see faces of the prisoners who had once been housed in the facility. Those who have seen them say these faces seem to tempt them to come closer, possibly luring them into a trap. Others say that these faces come with an incredibly foreboding sensation that warns the witnesses to stay far away. One of the most notorious encounters from cell block 4 comes from a locksmith named Gary Johnson, who was once hired to replace all of the locks during a renovation project. While he was working, Gary claimed that he was overcome by the feeling that someone was watching him. Gary knew that he was alone, but the feeling was unmistakable, so he looked up to check. The corridors were empty. No one else was there. But whenever Gary went back to work on the locks, he would get that same feeling again. On some primal level, Gary could tell that an incredibly negative energy was coming out of the cell that he was currently working on. And when he looked into it, he saw the apparition of several faces twisted and distorted in agony. One of those faces then transformed into a shadowy figure that dove across the cell for Gary. Needless to say, Gary ran straight out of there. But tormented prisoners aren't the only things still said to haunt the corridors of the Eastern State Penitentiary. A shadow figure is often spotted down the long hallways. Those who have seen him say that he stands perfectly still until he is approached by witnesses. Then he will suddenly leap into action and dart down the corridor to completely vanish without a trace. A guard, perhaps? One of his colleagues is sometimes seen outside, still on duty, on top of one of the guard towers. Or is he something else? So the stories go, in 1924, poor old black Labrador Pep was sentenced to life in prison after killing the governor's cat. But the truth is that Pep was brought on as a therapy dog. He was given an inmate number and even had a mugshot, but Pep was no real inmate. Perhaps that's why he still seems happy when he's caught running along the corridors, barking and playing with something that no one else can see. Although those who have heard him howling in the dead of night might have different ideas as to why he's stuck around. For all intents and purposes, the Eastern State Penitentiary forever changed the judicial system, and not necessarily for the better. After a visit to the facility, Charles Dickens condemned the prison and claimed that the mental anguish inflicted upon the prisoners living there was far worse than any physical pain. By 1913, the practice of forced isolation and solitary confinement had all but been abandoned, and by 1971, so too was the entire prison. By then, damage to the structural integrity of the building and the electrics were too severe to warrant the cost of restoring them. The prison was closed and the property was completely abandoned for the next 20 years. When city planners revisited the site, they found that it had been overrun by vegetation and families of feral cats had taken over. The building was eventually bought up by a non-profit organisation that then transformed it into a museum. It reopened to the public in 1994 and now provides several guided tours, most of them rather spooky in nature. I genuinely would highly recommend reading that Charles Dickens article. So he wrote it in, I think it was 1849, and I came across that article years ago when I was still teaching English, and he basically went and saw this very real execution that happened, and he was so appalled by what he saw that he wrote a letter to the Times the next day that ended up being published, and he was completely against public executions. Like he wasn't saying that execution shouldn't happen, you know, and he advocated for private executions, but I think he was just so shocked by what he saw. It was just this mad circus atmosphere that went on for like 24 hours. It would go on all day and all night, where people would have an absolute sesh to end all seshes. There were like sex workers everywhere, and people kind of partaking in the services of sex workers everywhere, and people getting like blackout drunk, people fighting, people like singing songs. It was like this great time of entertainment, and he just was like, this is insane. Like, these two people are hanging for this awful crime that they've done, and we're treating this spectacle as though it is like the party event of the year. And you'd like to think that, you know, oh, if that was happening, if in my town or city they still had public executions like that, I wouldn't partake in stuff like that. And I would, it was a different time. Like, it was a different time, and people had different morals and different attitudes towards these public spectacles, these public executions. And if an execution was particularly juicy, like if it was a woman, for example, or in this case, if it's a husband and wife being executed together, then it was the bigger the party. And this was a period of time all over the world where people were starting to go, I don't know if this justice system is working, really. And I don't know if these prison systems are working. you have to remember as well that a lot of these prisons, you know, in this period of time, they were overcrowded, filthy. There was people in there who, you know, murderers, right down to like petty thieves. Just a lot of kind of people all being shoved in together, and that's never going to end well. And I can fundamentally understand why across the pond Quakers were thinking, there's got to be a better way that we can do this without fueling violence with violence. So somebody's violent, so we punish them with more violence. Like it doesn't make any sense. And I don't know very much about the Quaker faith. So if you don't know, Quakers are a religious society of friends. It's a Christian movement, and they don't have like a clergy. And one of their key facets is non-violence. So, you know, they're pacifists. They don't participate in war or any form of violence, which, you know, fundamentally is, I would argue, quite a positive thing. And I think that now we look back at the setting up of the Eastern State Penitentiary and we think, oh my God, it was never going to work, right? But I understand, I can see the logic of thinking, right, violence is not deterring people from doing crimes. Violence is not stopping people from reoffending. Punishment in this way is not helpful. So what do people need to do? And you'd kind of, on a very basic fundamental level, you can see how people went, well, I think that actually people need time to think about what they did and think about why they did it. Like at a very basic fundamental human level, that is really what kind of atoning for crimes is. It's not just saying, sorry, I did the thing. It's trying to understand, well, why did I do the thing in the first place? So I do think that like basic fundamental thought was there when the Eastern State Penitentiary was set up. And it probably was set up with genuinely good intentions. But humans are not meant to be in isolation for that length of time. And I guess you can see that the good intention was there. I mean, having these, at the time, state-of-the-art cells that had central heating and running water and a flushing toilet. Like, there was a thought there to be like, okay, well, these prisoners don't need to be wildly uncomfortable to serve their time. They don't need to be on a straw mat with 25 other people in a cell and a bucket in the corner where disease is spreading like wildfire. Actually, we can make sure that their basic human needs like heat, you know, water and a decent place to go to the toilet are met. And, you know, you can see that there was good intention there. But obviously, that did not work. You know, putting people in isolation and solitary confinement like that does not work. And it never ceases to amaze me the way in which we as humans find new and novel ways to punish people all the time, you know? Like having an iron gag when somebody is just trying to communicate with other prisoners, probably out of desperation and loneliness. Like it's against the rules. How do you punish people when you're a non-violent organisation, but equally you have to punish people, but they already have nothing. There's nothing that you can take away from them, you know? In my honest and humble opinion, it baffles me if places like the Eastern State Penitentiary aren't haunted. Because I just think if anywhere in the world is going to be haunted, it's going to be the old lunatic asylums and the old penitentiaries and even prisons now. Like we know statistically, based on the numbers of reoffenders, etc., we know that the prison system, at least in Ireland, the UK and in the US, it doesn't work. It doesn't operate in the way that it should. It doesn't deter in the way that it should. And we know that there are huge amounts of suffering and anguish and strife that occurs often needlessly within the prison system. And that's like a perfect storm for hauntings, for an emotional stain to be left on a place, you know, whether you think it's residual, whether you think it's like stone tape theory, whether the walls like absorb events and feelings and anger and all that jazz and plays it back at a later date. I do think that prisons and the old lunatic asylums are the perfect places for that to happen. I also don't think that Al Capone was haunted, by the way. That story is always perpetuated when people talk about Al Capone, particularly in relation to Alcatraz and, you know, in this case, the Eastern State Penitentiary. When I was in Alcatraz, there was obviously so much about Al Capone and also interestingly, a lot about other prisoners and the fact that a lot of these prisoners likely had undiagnosed mental health conditions. And you can, postulate as to what those mental health conditions might have been now based on behaviours, etc. But you're probably not going to fully know. But I think Al Capone was a man who had syphilis. And when syphilis finally gets to your brain and starts eating away at your brain, that's late stage syphilis, And I think that is a man who was guilty and also had an illness that was ravaging his brain, and therefore those two things probably combined to, create an absolutely horrific experience for him every time he closed his eyes to go sleep. But it must have been terrifying for the people to hear it. Like, Al Capone had this reputation of being this absolute terrifying gangster, and he had orchestrated all these awful things. And like I said in the story, when he was finally in Alcatraz, he wasn't locked up for murder. He was locked up for tax evasion, for fraud. And people were looking at this man going, you have the power to do all these things. And yet at nighttime, you are screaming the place down like a child and screaming about how you're desperate for Jimmy to leave you alone. It must have been petrifying in itself. And of course, that's going to create ghost stories. And I'm saying this now as a complete aside, as somebody who taught sex education for a very long time. If you're listening to this and you're sexually active, please make sure that you get tested regularly. Syphilis is still very much knocking around and still very much does the same thing as it did all those years ago. But syphilis is also very, very treatable, which is good news. And no, nowadays you do not need to sit in a bath of mercury or whatever else they tried to do to cure syphilis back in the day. You just get some medication and then you'll be fine. The people who listen to this with their kids are definitely like, brilliant, thanks Emma. I've got a lot to explain now based on what you've just said randomly on the podcast. It's a weird episode. We're going from Charles Dickens to the Quakers to syphilis and Al Capone, and finally we might eventually get to ghosts. I do often wonder as well about the psychological impact of, being in places like the Eastern State Penitentiary, right? They are places where there are stories of ghosts. They are places where it's a big, imposing building. They're fundamentally scary buildings, and you are there with an expectation, with a knowledge that human beings suffered there, that people died there, like probably, hundreds of people died there. And is that part of the reason why we see these shadows flitting, or why we see these grotesque faces or hear whispers in the corridors? I mean, that's not to say that these things aren't actually happening, in a paranormal way. That's not to say that at all. But there is, I think, a psychological element to at least some of these things. We are going into places like the Eastern State Penitentiary with an expectation that this place is going to scare us in one way or another. And I genuinely can't cope with the fact that Pep, the little black Labrador, was brought in and given an inmate number and a mugshot. That makes me want to curl up into a ball and die. I mean, it's adorable. But it sounds like he had a pretty good time, that he was running around and playing, which is a good thing. That's a nice thing. And if a dog is well looked after, he doesn't know he's in prison. He's having a nice time. I think the Eastern State Penitentiary is somewhere that I would go to and be interested and curious about the history and the stories and the lives of the prisoners that had been there and what day-to-day life was like. But I think I would... the cynical part of me and the kind of skeptical part of me would be very aware of the psychological priming that happens when you go to somewhere like that. And like I said, that's not to say that weird spooky shit doesn't happen there. Those are the type of places where I think stuff does happen. And I would be interested to visit, and I would like to hear if anybody has visited, especially because they offer tours and stuff now. I'm sure there are definitely listeners who have been and visited the Eastern State Penitentiary. But in short, for this episode, that article, that letter from Charles Dickens to the Times is genuinely really interesting. And the prison system doesn't work. And also, get tested. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or for $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Take control of the numbers and supercharge your small business with Xero. That's Xero. With our easy-to-use accounting software with automation and reporting features, you'll spend less time on manual tasks and more time understanding how your business is doing. 87% of surveyed U.S. customers agree Xero helps improve financial visibility. Search Xero with an X or visit Xero.com/ACAST to start your 30-day free trial. Conditions apply.